Caiphus, wandering king. There are too many of them. The realization made Caiphas's blood run cold. The marked men, these strangers, kept pouring into his throne room. Caiphus hurled lightning into the advancing ranks, but their leader only laughed. Around them, tendrils of shadow crept forward. "Sire, save us!" the Umbran roared from the gathering darkness. "I have no choice." Groaning, the back of the heavy stone seat whirled to life, shaking the spire until masonry rained down. With a howl of fury, the strangers were swept away by a wave of power as piercing light arced from the throne. "Light? What is this light?" Caiphus gasped. The last words he heard were those of his gloating advisor. "The end and the beginning." He awoke to the sound of a bird he'd never heard before, his body warm from the sun overhead. Every fiber of his body aching, Caiphus forced himself to sit up. A wisp landed on his knee, pulsing with warm orange light. Caiphus shooed it away as he looked around. "Where am I?" He stood shedding ash and dust from his beaten armor. He was in the middle of a field. Around him, flowers and grass waved gently in the breeze. Turning, Caiphus searched the horizon. There were no landmarks he recognized, no jagged sky-cragged mountain range, no looming felled wood, no distant walls of Argenport. Despite the unfamiliar plain around him, something about it felt familiar. "The throne," he grimaced. "No matter. I will extract an explanation when I return." Steeling himself for a long journey, he decided to head in a northerly direction and set out. A week into his travel, deep into rocky canyon lands, a dragon began to circle overhead. As the beast swept low, Caiphus attempted to hail it. If this dragon was capable of speech, it had little to say, though its intent was clear. Caiphus rolled to one side and hurled thunder, not at the beast, but at the canyon wall. A section of it collapsed, slamming into the dragon's wing. As Caiphus ducked beneath its heavy claws, the beast snapped at him, hissing in fury. With a gesture, Caiphus brought down more rocks, weighing down its other wing. Satisfied that the creature was hobbled, Caiphus continued on his way. After the canyons, the horizon flattened into ruddy scrubland. By day, the sun beat down endlessly. By night, malicious lights swarmed him, keeping him awake. As exhaustion slowed his pace, a pack of unfamiliar beasts began shadowing his steps. Knowing he could not outrun or outlast them, Caiphus set up camp. They came for him that night. Weak as he was able to make an example of the pack's leader, and the rest scattered. Weeks began to blur together as the Badlands twisted on, a thick haze choking the air. Cairns and pillars of ancient engraved stones gleamed through the haze. The Shadowlands. Delirium set in as the way through the shadow twisted and parted before him and closed again behind. As it darkened, Caiphus began to hear whispers. "This is your fault. Weak, afraid. Your son will never truly know you. Your sister and uncle will drive themselves mad searching for answers. Your wife must bear all your burdens, and your daughter will never know what became of you." Gritting his teeth, Caiphus took a shard of waystone and lashed it to a branch taken from a warped dead tree. Shadow curled away from the faint light of the blade. But as he continued, the whispers redoubled, coalescing with the mist into the form of his Umbran advisor. "You cannot be here," Caiphus spat from a parched, cracked mouth, shocked at how rough his voice sounded. "How long has it been since I have spoken?" "Perceptive as always, my liege," the Umbran said with a mocking bow. "Yet here I am. A king should not die alone after all." "Who are you?" Caiphus bellowed, thrusting with his makeshift spear. The azure blade cut into the figure, which fell apart into mist. Coiling and hissing, shadow collected and reformed into the Umbran. I have worn many faces and have taken many names, though I suppose there is little risk now in answering. You may call me Zindel. The surrounding shadow reacted to the name, deepening until only his glowing eyes were visible. Why tell me now? Caiphus grunted, not slowing his pace. Azindel merely grinned, fading back into the haze and leaving Caiphus alone. The shadow in which he found himself was warped and tortured, but not without its own raw power. Perhaps he could channel that power, use it to contact his family. With an effort of will, Caiphus started to reach out. But to whom? Caleb. Caiphus could rely on him to burn a path through the Shadowlands to find his father. That's what Caiphus would have done, and he trusted that Caleb would act the same. Finding shelter beneath a cliff face, Caiphus sat and focused, closing his eyes, picturing his son. He tried to send a vision, a mirage of himself. Such a sending would be difficult, and maintaining it would require concentration, but their shared blood would strengthen the link. The image he projected of himself began to move in his mind's eye, pushing forward through a crushing, oppressive darkness. He trembled with the effort, his face contorted and sweating, before finally collapsing in a heap, exhausted by searing pain in his head. Around him, the winds howled as starless night closed in. As the journey stretched on, he lost all sense of time and place. Days went by where he encountered nothing but darkness and faint lights, while some nights were filled with terror, nightmares boiling out of the shadow to hurl themselves at him. Caiphus met them with bursts of flame, and used the light of their smoldering ashes to light his way. His attempt to contact his wife failed next. Eileen was capable and stubborn, and would have confronted Azindel directly if she knew of his treachery. Caiphus was able to travel further through the darkness in his mind this time. A glimmer of blue lightning dilated into view for a brief moment before fatigue and pain overtook him again. Shame, the vision of Azindel said, standing over him as he lay curled in a ball. Your wild queen is desperate to hear from you. Caiphus raised his head enough to dispel the mist with what little force he had left, and then fell into a dark, dreamless sleep. Much later, he huddled at the base of an ancient monolith, listless, despair overtaking him. Caiphus had always been a man of immense clarity, confidence, and power, but those were all gone now, drained away, seeping into the shadow with each breath. He looked up at the stone, and his thoughts turned to Lear. As long as he could remember, his older sister had been bemused by his single-mindedness. She gave counsel when he sought it, but otherwise remained aloof, as if she could see more that way. He could imagine her arched eyebrows expressing a restrained concern, many words unspoken. He woke later, his eyes heavy, and raised himself up, his back leaning against the warm rock. The realization of the stone's warmth came over him slowly, as did the fact that he was bathed in a faint gold light emanating from the stone's indecipherable runes. His strength was waning, all but gone, but Talir's power was great. There was still a chance she could sense him here at the edge of the void. He closed his eyes, imagining her face, mustering an effort to reach out to her. Before he had, she was there, in his mind's eye, older, different than when he'd seen her last, yet the same. She gestured toward him, bathing him in an energy and warmth that seemed like a lost memory, but then, abruptly, she receded, disappearing as through a tunnel in the dark. He cried out and collapsed once more, but this time he did not sleep in shadow. He was old and had seen much. Those of his family measured generations as decades, He was old, but still he dreamed of sun-kissed land, familiar but new, one where the hardened experience of his years melted, and gave way to delight and wonder at things he'd only imagined, but had never seen before. The memories of his family swirled around him, had driven him, were a part of him, but at the same time they receded. He was bound to someplace new. They would find their way as he had. He had work to do. When he opened his eyes, the warmth of his dreams remained. The chill, the emptiness that had overwhelmed him in this dark land resumed its proper place, not gone, not forgotten, but once more in balance. Caiphus stood. His urge to return to Argenport, to the throne, was gone. But he knew that he still had old business to attend to before he moved on. With a gesture, he shattered the waystone that had given him shelter and warmth, the monolith that had been the conduit for his sister's gift. The broken shards hummed and glowed as he gathered them together. Now Caiphus moved with renewed purpose. He would need help. If the shadow kept twisting his path, sending him on an endless journey until he was no more, then he would change the game. He needed a place of power, and the fragments guided him now. From one waystone to the next, gathering shards of the ancient stones, looking for a place to make his stand. Eventually he found it, a twisted corner of roots and stone that he could build upon. Carefully, Caiphus arranged waystone shards in a circle, forcing the shadow back. As he worked to complete the circle, he studiously ignored the sneering Umbran pacing around the perimeter. When this plan fails, will you have the good grace to go mad and starve like every other fool that winds up here? The Umbran asked. Caiphus continued to ignore his adversary, focusing on his goal. He needed the correct mix and placement of shards, something strong but subtle to support his efforts, a persistent whisper, part of the shadow itself, not a beacon that a Zendel could snuff out. He glanced at the Umbran, then sat closing his eyes. With a breath he reached out. Vara, find me, my child. Follow the shadow, Caiphus whispered. The projection of himself moving easily, a shadow within shadow, faint but unable to be stopped. As Caiphus's message wove through the endless twilight, Azendel's eyes gleamed with malice. Yes, the hidden one, ever beyond my reach. His face twisted into a dark smile. Find her, and I shall follow. As Caiphus watched, Azendel's form shifted, shrinking down to the shape of a human, holding a twisted staff. His voice had changed too, but it still held the same menace as he crowed. I must thank you for tying up this last loose end. When I find her, I'll see to it that she doesn't even remember your name. As Zendel cupped his hand, and the shadow twisted round, forming into a heavy pendant. It is polite to bring a gift for royalty, yes? Good, you fool, Caiphus grimaced. Vara will end you. I will be there when it happens. Azindel ignored him, vanishing into the darkness, and leaving Caiphus alone once again. Around him, the Waystone's light cast harsh shadows. Past that, the shadow hissed, like a predator held at bay. The Shadowlands were a malicious, twisting labyrinth. Caiphus smiled. He had a long, dark road to walk to return home. He turned around to head back the way he had come. Find me, my child. Chapter 24. Petitions! She had waited long enough. The family had returned, settling in to rule Argenport, and for the first time in years the city was quiet. Healing, even. She had the right to demand the same for her people. The morning of her audience, Svetya dressed in what little finery she had. Then she brushed Moknadi's fur until it shone, polished his armor to match, and roused the remnants of the bear guard. Today they marched on the spire. She was the Oreen of Kosel, and they would hear her. In the spire, 4 chairs sat on a dais in front of the eternal throne. The first was a heavy wooden chair covered in furs. Eileen sat in it, regal and cool, her bodyguard at her side. Next was Caleb, held a chair of iron, his weapons within easy reach. Vara sat next to him, in a chair inlaid with black marble and purple gems. The last seat was Talir's, a well-worn leather chair with books and scrolls piled high on either side. It had been a long day. The 4 had heard many petitions for aid and judgment, some from influential figures, and others from more eccentric individuals. As the heavy stone doors to the throne room rumbled open again, a guard of the court cleared his throat and announced, "Lady Svetya Katerina Stormholt-Kurtz, Oreen of Kosel." Eileen and Caleb straightened up in their chairs, sharing a quick glance. Vara nodded and gestured. "Show her in." Svetya entered. She had left her retinue at the gates, and now wished Moknadi was by her side. Heart pounding, she approached the 4 seats and bowed deeply. "Honored rulers, thank you for your audience. I am Svetya, Oreen of Kosel. I gained the title when my father, the Orin, was slaughtered with the rest of my family as we fled a brutal coup. The sun was setting and large bonfires helped turn the clouds over the courtyard dark red. In the distance, the spires of Korovyat Palace looked as if they were stained with blood. "Appropriate," Yushkov noted. Looking down, he surveyed the crowds. Men and women huddled around the huge fires, tearing into haunches of roast meat with their bare hands. Yushkov had supplied lavish amounts of beer too, and watched as the crowds broke upon another barrel, cheering. "They are right to celebrate," he thought with satisfaction. "Tonight, Kosel will be reborn. The stars align. The time is right, my Orin," his advisor whispered from behind him. Nodding, Yushkov pushed himself to his feet. He was a large, stocky man, made all the more so by layers of heavy winter clothing. A distant offshoot to the current royal family, he was known as the Hammer of Kosel by many. Over the past few months, he had held many rallies like this. Climbing the steps of a rickety podium, he raised a hand to quiet more cheers. "Citizens of Kosel," he said, voice booming over the frozen cobbles, "my friends, too long have we sat by and watched our once proud empire rot. Our borders shrink, whole villages go hungry, and wolves howl at our doors." The crowd hissed and booed. Yushkov could feel their eyes on him, the heat of the fires and the bite of winter air. "My life has led to this moment. It has been foretold." He continued, his deep voice thundering. "We know where the weakness lies. Is it with you, who toil in fields and workshops to keep your families warm?" "No!" the crowd bellowed. "Of course not," Yushkov shouted back. "You are Kosel, hearty, strong, resourceful." There were whoops and jeers, but he kept talking, throwing a hand out to point at the tall towers of the palace. "The Orin and his family sit up there, draped in furs they did not clean, eating food they did not hunt. They allow strangers into our land. They join new religions and speak of treaties. These are not the actions of true power. This is treachery. Kosel needs no allies. Kosel needs no aid. Kosel needs strength. Lead us!" Caiphus, a voice in the crowd called out. Looking down, Yushkov saw the crooked grin of his advisor. "What was that?" he asked, cupping a large hand to his ear. "Lead us!" the crowd thundered. "Then help me, friends. To keep Koso strong, we must tear out this weakness." Slowly this time, Yushkov extended a thick finger to point the towers of the palace, savoring the moment. "And there lies the source." Hands grabbed at Svetya. Startled, she awoke to someone covering her mouth. Her mother stood over her, face close, pale and wide-eyed. "The palace is warm. She can't be shivering from the cold," Svetya thought groggily. In the distance she heard shouting. Frantically, her mother pulled her hand away and whispered, "Wake the twins! They are coming for Papa, for the Oren. The palace has already fallen. We must hurry." Sudden fear made Svetya's hands go numb, tingling like early frostbite. Sitting up, she stared at her mother. "What do we do?" "Out through the kitchens. There's a dirt road for servants and carts. Your father has gone for Zelen in the carriage. I have the royal relics. You go get the twins." Svetya nodded, throwing herself out of bed. Zelen was her father's mount, a caring, shaggy brown bear. He was old, but strong enough to pull the whole family in their carriage. The three royal children had grown up with the bear roughhousing in Zelen's watchful shadow as their father governed. Who would want to hurt Papa? Svetya wondered as she ran. The hall to the twins' room was on the third story and looked over a hedge-lined lawn. Moonlight from the tall windows framed generations of royal family portraits. "Halt!" The shout came from the grounds below. Pressing her hand to the chill glass, Svetya saw her father's steward, Laszlo, standing next to an ornate fountain. He wore a heavy bathrobe and gestured with his silver cane, shouting at the mob that was climbing over the remains of a shattered iron gate. They held torches and brandished many weapons and tools. Someone barked a harsh command, and Svetya watched the crowd part. A figure strode through them. He was large, heavy with muscle, and had a blunt, cruel face. As he entered the torchlight, Svetya saw blood seeping into his fine clothes, though he appeared unharmed. In one hand, he carried a large hammer. This had been too easy, Yushkov thought as he stalked towards the old man. The palace guard had been well armed, but the mob outnumbered them 15-1. The steward was shaking, but he held his ground, shouting, "You should not be here! This is an outrage!" Yushkov swung the hammer and felt something snap as the old man went down. "Look at this!" Yushkov bellowed, holding the groaning man up for the crowd. "A toady to the weak Oren. And what do we do with weakness?" The roar of the crowd was indiscriminate, but the bloodlust in their eyes was clear. With ease, Yushkov shoved the steward's head beneath the ice-cold water of the fountain. "This has been foretold," he thought as his audience cheered and the old man kicked. Soon I will be the Oren." As the steward stopped thrashing, Yushkov heard a faint sound. Turning, he saw a young girl with bright blonde hair in a third-story window. She was sobbing, tears running down her face. "So, the royal family is awake," he thought. "Tonight they will see true Ghusl strength." "But I survived," Svetya said. The spire's throne room stayed silent as she took a long, shuddered breath. Eileen's expression was carefully neutral. but Svetya thought she saw fury in her eyes. Both Vara and Caleb were frowning, the latter gripping the arms of his throne so tightly that his fingers were bloodless and white. Talir was looking up from her scrolls too, her eyes wide. My parents and siblings were slaughtered, run down as we fled, and that is why I am before you today, Svetya continued, to ask for. With a crash, the doors to the throne room were thrown open. Drums thundered and rolled, drowning out Svetya's pleas. She whirled around. Coastal mages in fine furs stood in front of each door, and before anyone in the room could speak, one of them roared, "Make way for His Highness Yushkov Basilfluk Kurtz, Savior of the people and Orin of the Great Coastal Empire." "What is this?" Eileen said, standing as Yushkov entered, draped in fine robes with crimson silk sleeves and gold cuffs. He sat on the back of his own mount, an enormous battle-scarred bear with ash-gray fur and heavy, jagged teeth, eyes glittering. Yushkov watched Svetya, reveling in her shock. Svetya's heart pounded in her head, and her throat felt dry as she watched the man who ordered her family's murder turn to face the four seats. "Honored rulers of Argenport, Who are you? You have no right to be here," Caleb shouted, standing as well. "I have every right," Yushkov roared over Caleb. "I am Yushkov, Orin of the Coastal Empire, and as Orin, I came to formally withdraw Koso from the treaty that once bound our powers." Yushkov stared haughtily, his mount snarling. "You what?" Vara growled, her eyes flaring with anger. Yushkov stared down his nose at her, and then said flatly, "Koso is stronger alone." Turning to address the room, Yushkov threw open his hands. "But for our years of friendship, I bring this parting gift." Reaching beneath him, he tossed a heavy fur down in front of the four seats. It unrolled as it hit the ground, and Svetya saw a familiar, shaggy head. The pelt was all that remained of her father's bear. Shock gave way to fury, and Svetya found her voice, shouting, "Zelen!" as she whirled to glare at the man who wore her father's crown.